Hi, today I'm going to read Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Can you see there's some little fingerprints there? Messy fingerprints. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he had been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name and messy by nature. Look at his house. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, the tiles were missing from the roof, the flower bed was overgrown with weeds, and the gate was off its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? No, he had not. Oh dear. Mr. Messy, one morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed and yawned, scratched, got up, cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste, and had his breakfast, spilling the cornflakes all over the floor. And then he set off for a walk, tripping over a brush he left lying in the garden 2 weeks before. There was a wood behind Mr. Messy's house with a messy garden, and that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large wood with lots and lots of trees, just like our Wendover woods. And it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it, but he didn't mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and he walked right through the woods until he came to the other side. And do you know what he found on the other side of the woods? What could it be? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest looking little cottage he had ever seen. It had a lovely garden with a stream running right through the middle of it. It's a very pretty cottage. There was a man in the garden, clipping the hedge. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking up and down. "And I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing from outside the house. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat, tidy and neat," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "Tidy things up," said Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than normal that particular morning. But I don't want to be neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy, looking downright miserable at the thought of it. This is their van and it says neat and tidy. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. "But," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But," said Mr. Messy. "But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and bundling him into his van, which was parked behind the house, off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the wood. "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days." They both said together at the same time. "Better do something about it," said Mr. Neat. And before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there all about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed and pruned and snipped and clipped and cleaned and dug and made the garden look neater than it had ever been before. You see? And Mr. Tidy primmed and rubbed and painted and mended and made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then they both went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning, and they both set about cleaning the house from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. Stay there. Can you see? There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, said Mr. Tidy. What are we both thinking? They said together to Mr. Messy. Is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy said was no use. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom upstairs. Can you see he's in the bath? He doesn't look very happy, does he? It had been the messiest room in the house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin, which means it's very, very clean. Then Mr. Neat got hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight in the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having baths. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look messy at all. He looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now, he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked a bit worried. You see, he looks very neat and tidy. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. And then they chuckled. And Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And then Mr. Messy laughed. And then they all laughed together because they were best of friends. And that is really the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from these two people. And you know what they're called, don't you? So make sure you keep your rooms tidy and look after yourselves. Thank you for listening. Bye.